course. Alrighty. So as you're coming in, go ahead and say hello to our esteemed guests and facilitator.
Hello.
I see lots of recognizable names.
I love seeing the avalanche of names.
And as you're coming in, if you want to say hey, go ahead and make certain that you are sending it out to all panelists and attendees. So you can make sure that you toggle back and forth. So then that way all of your fellow attendees can also see it. So not just to the 4 panelists. I see everybody's saying hey. I say lots of returning people.
That's good. Great. It is wonderful to see everybody coming in from all over the church. It's wonderful to see familiar names, if only for a microsecond. And it's terrific to be back together with this event. We'll wait just a couple of more minutes until we get a critical mass, and we'll begin. Michael Burke.
And I see a lot of people who are just saying hey to panelists. Make sure that you, right up above where you type in your message, the little blue button, it's a drop down. So go ahead and make sure you're saying hey to all panelists and attendees. That's also really important if you want your message to be seen by the other participants as well.
Great. Holly Rencher.
Holly Rencher.
Good heavens. It's like old home week. Yeah. All right. I know that we have more people who are going to be coming into the room, and I want to begin by just welcoming you to this gathering on liturgical formation. My name is Paul Fromberg, and I am the chair of the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music. We have more than 500 people from across the Episcopal Church and other denominations registered, and we get some portion of that number at each of our sessions. We're coming together for conversation about liturgy and sharing current initiatives of the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music and the Taskforce on Liturgical and Prayer Book Revision as we prepare for the 80th General Convention. Some of our participants have asked how the particular plenary topics were chosen. And it's really all about preparation for the next General Convention. Today, we're going to be focusing on 2 areas of interest for General Convention. Our first plenary will be about the Task Force for Liturgical and Prayer Book Revision, which some people call the TIFL-FIBR, but it's hard for me to say that. And the second will be about the Book of Common Prayer, specifically issues related to language, translation, culture, and race. Just a reminder that the Q&A button at the bottom of the window is the best place to put your questions. And those questions will be collated and curated by our backstage team. Also remember, everything you put in the chat box, write and love, because as I said yesterday, we're all going to end up in heaven together. And again, this gathering is co-sponsored by the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music, Lifelong Learning at Virginia Theological Seminary, and Church Publishing. And we will be making recordings and transcripts of these conversations available, and we will send out notices to registered participants when those are ready. We begin today with the plenary talking about the Task Force on Liturgy and Prayer Book Revision. And we have 2 friends who will be in conversation. The Right Reverend Nel Alexander is the Bishop Resigned of the Diocese of Atlanta and is also the chair of the Task Force on Liturgy and Prayer Book Revision. He's the author of the 2014 book, Celebrating Liturgical Time, Days, Weeks, and Seasons, the former dean of the School of Theology at Sewanee. He continues to serve there as professor of liturgy and Charles Todd Quintard Professor of Theology. The Reverend Dr. Cameron Partridge is the rector of St. Aidan's Episcopal Church in San Francisco and is also a member of the Taskforce on Liturgy and Prayer Book Revision. He completed a doctorate in theology at Harvard Divinity School in 2008, and in 2014, he was the first transgender priest to preach at the National Cathedral. Neil, in December, you said to the Episcopal Church's Public Affairs Office the following: General Convention called for bishops to engage worshiping communities in experimentation and the creation of alternative texts. We want the richness of these liturgical experiments born out of the needs of local communities to inform our work toward liturgical revision. What do you see as the greatest liturgical needs that the task force is hearing from local communities?
Well, thank you, Paul, and thanks to everyone for joining us, and greetings to friends old and new all across the church and all across a variety of time zones. One of the, you may remember yesterday, for those of you who were in yesterday's session, when Jim and Liza talked about, the calendar sort of rising up from the ground with local commemorations that become diocesan commemorations that become church-wide commemorations. Well, in our experience, liturgy often grows from the ground up. And congregations and worshiping communities are looking for ways to enrich what the church provides, and in many cases to provide for what shall we say, holes in the liturgical tradition, where in the local context there's a particular need. Maybe that's a pastoral need, maybe that's a need that we might refer to as a missional need because of the context they're in. And so, liturgies tend to grow. And then some of them grow and flourish and become, shall we say, perennials. Others grow and are just seasonal for a short time or for a specific purpose or whatever. And so the resolution, the enabling resolution of this work that formed the task force, one of the several important charges that the General Convention gave to the task force was to get some sense of what's actually going on out there. And because we know that that across the church, there's enormous variety. For example, some dioceses and their bishops and their liturgical leaders, play it pretty close to the vest, so to speak. It's a pretty straightforward 1979 prayer book with minimal enrichment, minimal variation, and so forth. Others expand that to the Enriching Our Worship series or other liturgical materials that the church has put out provisionally or in some cases somewhat more permanently. They use the resources of Book of Vocational Services, more richly, a whole variety of things. And then there are those other places where the bishops and rectors and priests and so forth have been in conversation and have been encouraging, congregations to use not only the maximal resources of the prayer book, but to use some of the guidelines and permissions in the prayer book tradition and so forth to expand what they need. I just a couple obvious examples of this historically. If you look in our Enriching Our Worship series, I can't remember, I think it's probably volume 4 or 5 maybe, but it's the one that has a number of liturgical materials provided by the SCLM and approved by the conventions in the past, around, for example, the burial of children, is wonderful and helpful and resourceful and rich as we find the burial rites of the prayer book. One of the places that it's not particularly good is if you're having to bury a child or if you're having to bury someone who has taken their own life for some tragic reason. And maybe even we could say accidental death is not particularly well responded to. So, and so those are resources that are there. But how did that happen? Well, that happened because in individual communities out there, clergy who had to respond to these situations, who did not have collects or prayers or litanies for these occasions, created them. And then they got shared with their bishop, eventually perhaps with others in their diocese, eventually with the SCLM, and then eventually into the church's wider liturgical resources. So part of what we've been doing is reaching out to diocesan liturgical commissions and other places to really kind of get a sense of what's going on out there, both in terms of what materials may be out there already and you know, it may be that some of those liturgies are not ready for prime time as a whole, but there may be a collect, or there may be a litany, or there may be something in that mix that really does have enduring value for the larger life of the church. So so that's one piece of it. The other piece, though, is also for us as a task force, and eventually, you know, however this, we'll talk about this later in the time, but however this work continues past the next General Convention, it's not just a matter of what's out there that's good, that we like, that we want to keep, but it's also using that process to help us identify gaps that we need to fill, even if we're not yet aware of something that needs to fill that gap. You know, and so if there's a particular kind of ministry, whether that's a pastoral ministry, whether that's a particular missionary exercise, outreach, evangelism, you know, whatever it may be, that needs a particular kind of rite that doesn't exist, we may find one out there and edit it and improve it and whatever, or in some cases, we may have to put our heads together and just create some things. So that's a big piece of what we've been doing, is to collect the information on that. We're not about to, this next General Convention, just so you know, we're not putting out any text for approval. We anticipate that will begin happening at the next General Convention. But let me just give you a quick idea of some of the stuff. We have a number of things that have come in from across the church, just some examples. One example that we had that we enjoyed reading and looking at, and that some version of this will probably have a future, is a Eucharistic prayer that is particularly designed for weddings. Currently we have, you know, in Rite 2, we have 4 Eucharistic prayers that do have their own sort of thematic nuances, but this is one that was really quite worthy of further reflection, at least, that was written and designed and submitted as an appropriate Eucharistic prayer for weddings. There's also one that was done that got a good bit of attention from us, which was a Eucharistic prayer for Christmas. Again, not that, I mean, we now, you know, not that the ones that we have are not positive and useful and helpful, but there's that. Another thing that was kind of interesting that you know, again, I'm not talking about any decision that's been made here, because no decisions have been made. The task force is, you know, we're in the process of evaluating, studying, thinking through things, and making recommendations in terms of a way forward to the convention. But one of the things that we received that was a really kind of interesting thing is you know, if you were to desire a Eucharistic liturgy that is still essentially Rite 1, but to the greatest degree possible, put that in inclusive language, what would that look like? You know, now that again, we're not recommending that, or we're not pushing that forward at this point, but it has raised some interesting head scratching time for the task force, and we believe there's some pieces in that pressing that forward to the developmental stage of all this in the next triennium is probably worth a deeper conversation. So Paul, I'll stop there at the moment, but I can certainly say more about that. But that's the idea that we've been working on those particular items.
Great. Cameron, I want to ask you, at the 78th General Convention, you were blogging about your testimony to the proposed naming liturgies that have been added to the Book of Occasional Services. And you wrote, to be able to take up one's name in the midst of one's congregation, to be named and seen in that way, can be a profound recognition of the deep spiritual significance of embodying one's name, I concluded. I was also struck that in addition to the other trans folks who testified, and again, there were several powerful speakers, there were non-trans ones as well, lifting up the flexibility of this resource to be used by many people. Cameron, how do you see liturgical innovations, such as the naming rite, affecting larger changes in the church?
Thank you for that question, Paul, and hello all. I really appreciated you reminding me of that experience, and I had forgotten that I had written that piece in that blog. Before I completely answered the question that you asked me, I'm noting how the memory and the quote links back to what Bishop Nel was just talking about, and the question about what rises up. And I know that naming rights, became something that that I was part of supporting at General Convention, because they were, occasions for them were arising across the church. And in fact, naming rights were happening. And there were different resources that people were drawing upon to do that. So I think what became the naming right draws upon some of those resources and emerged out of the pastoral need, because people who needed to claim a new name already were and are part of the church, and they were able to share both the frustration of not being able to do that when that was the case, and the joy and the profundity of experiencing being named and having something, having your profound embodied reality reflected and affirmed in community before God. So there was a sort of upwelling that led to the resolution that called for such a service to be created, and then to its creation. And also, that it's a variety of different folks who might change their name in the course of a lifetime. It includes trans, non-binary folks, but not only. And that was an important sort of sign in that moment too, the combination of folks who testified, and that reflects back on how our liturgical texts are meant to be expansive. They are not for just one sort of person. They are for the body of Christ, the collective body of Christ, that is many different sorts of people with various shared experiences and various differences in their experience. So that sort of the arc of that rite and its emergence sort of comes out of that. How does it affect larger changes in the church? How does a rite such as that, I mean, it's part of that process of seeking to have our liturgical texts reflect, catch up who we are, catch us, recognize us, or create space for our recognition, and to not harm us also, to recognize that we are multiplicity as the body of Christ, and that we are constantly learning how our language can adequately create space for that, even as we are drawing upon the deep riches of our tradition and wellspring of scripture included in that. So I think it affects liturgical worship and change going forward, in as much as it's a sign of a process of that welling up of a recognition of needing to do something differently than we've been doing it, and to recognize who's already present, and then also in the process to make space for who is not yet present, who would like to feel that they can be present, and who are not yet. So I feel like it's a profound and ongoing process that is true of other instances than just this particular one that that you raised the question about. And it's a process that's been going on for hundreds, thousands of years.
I'm curious, have you heard of other denominations using the naming right that we
Using the
developed?
naming right that's in the Book of Occasional Services?
Yeah,
No.
I'm just curious about
not.
this,
But
the
I mean,
influence of liturgy and other denominations and what that might look like as well.
yeah, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if that were true, just as, there were sources that we borrowed from that, that came to us from other instances of naming rights that were not specific. Some of the sourcing was Episcopal, but some of it was not. So, I mean, I think that's part of our ecumenical process. Wouldn't surprise me if that were true, but I don't specifically know of an instance of that.
Thank you for that. A lot of people have asked the question about the task force's relationship to the 1979 prayer book. And I have more than once made up a definition of what it means to memorialize the 79 prayer book. As I like to say, the things I make up are all completely plausible, if not entirely true. But now that we have the two of you, members of the task force, one of whom is a chair, what is the continuing role of the 1979 Book of Common Prayer?
Well, I'll be glad to take a run at that, and then I'm sure that Cameron will want to fill in some gaps. The way the task force reads that resolution and the use of memorialize, and we spent a fair amount of time debating it and talking about how the Episcopal Church uses that terminology in other contexts and how that might apply here and all that other kind of stuff. But at least at this point, the way the task force understands that is that the 1979 Book of Common Prayer will remain the centerpiece of our ongoing liturgical life into the future. How long that future is before a more wholesale revision comes along. I mean, if you imagine our liturgical history, for 1789, 1892, 1928, while there were in each of those revisions certain changes, the substantial whole of the book didn't change. A few amendments here and there and additions and subtractions, but I mean, it was not wholesale. The 1979 prayer book, I think it would be fair to say, was a wholesale revision where we certainly kept the book in the prayer book tradition, certainly kept it Anglican, certainly used the resources of modern liturgical and theological and sacramental scholarship and the resources of great poets and writers and whatever to make the language soar in places. And that was all very exciting. But what we believe is envisioned here is something more like the earlier revisions, in the sense that the substance of the 1979 prayer book as a whole will remain. And that the task before us then is really two things. Number one, to provide appropriate alternatives or enrichments, or shall we say amplifications. And I'll give you an example of that in a second, of what's in that book. But it doesn't change the book itself. And that book, it remains, at least for the foreseeable future, the centerpiece of our liturgical life. But then around that, in addition to things that shall we say, refine and adjust and well, frankly, improve upon certain things that we've learned about their prayer book after 40 years of pastoral use. It is still a wonderful and highly resourceful book. But for those of us who have used it for its 40-year history, we know 40-plus-year history. We know that there are places in it that could use, not wholesale reconceiving, but adjustment. And the church has made such adjustments in prayer books in the past without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So it's sort of that sort of ideas. What I mean by enrichments would be something like, and this we're not proposing this time around. This is just an example of the kind of enrichment we've been talking about this triennium in a more theoretical vein. But take, for example, the opening acclamation in the Eucharist. We currently have 3 of them, right? The more general one, then we have one for Lenten penitential seasons, then we have one for Easter. All fine and good. But in our tradition, the incarnation cycle, Advent, Christmas, and Epiphany, it is also theologically rich and liturgically rich and something that's a significant component of our theological tradition. So might we have an opening acclamation for the incarnation cycle, just as we have for Lent and Easter? We haven't written one. We don't know what that would sound like yet. We'll probably have a dozen, and then somehow that gets, worked down to one. But again, that wouldn't replace anything in the prayer book. The 3 that are there are already there, but it would be authorized in such a fashion that if a parish wanted to use the specific opening acclamation for the incarnation cycle, when it exists, that might be a good possibility. We know that there are ones out there. I'm not going to out anybody here, but I'm aware of parishes that use the Advent, Christmas, Epiphany acclamations from other prayer books of the Anglican Communion during that season, and do so at least with the toleration of their bishop, if not the permission and enthusiasm of their bishop. But that's just an example of where the prayer book in the rite and the flow and the sense of things really doesn't change, but it provides a text that we currently do not have, that many folks would we believe find enriching. So.
Cameron?
Yeah, so to just add to what Bishop Nel has said, I think you can see how the task force came to think about the 79 BCP and within the scope of prayer book revision in our Common Prayer Worship in the Episcopal Church document that was the first one that we put out as a task force, which is on the website that task force developed. And I think it's really helpful language, and it's brief. So if you don't mind, I'd like to read it. Resolution A068, which created this task force, calls us to memorialize the 79 BCP, create new liturgies, and use emerging technologies. Thus, we propose that the 79 BCP is the foundation and model for common prayer and liturgical development in the Episcopal Church. That the 79 BCP is maintained as an authorized text within a growing set of authorized liturgical materials for common prayer. That the primary platform for our authorized liturgies be digital and online, organized according to the shape of the 79 BCP, thus allowing for authorization of more material than is possible within the limits of a printed book, though printed books remain as an option. 4, that this new set of authorized liturgies be titled Common Prayer, Worship in the Episcopal Church, or something similar that sets it within the BCP tradition. 5, that authorized liturgies will be consistent with the Trinitarian baptismal and Eucharistic theology of the 79 BCP, and will be consonant with the directives of the General Convention with respect to liturgical language, inclusive and expansive language, and creation care, and will honor the Church's increasing diversity. And then 6, that we continue the requirement of approval by 2 consecutive General Conventions for authorized rites included in common prayer, and that we encourage the further development of alternate rites for use. So you can see from that there's, as Bishop Nel was describing, that shape of the BCP is what is there, and that there's additional rites and additions to existing rights that can come into that. And I think it's exciting that it's envisioned to be online, where it makes the accessibility, I find, to be significantly easier. I know that's not necessarily true for everyone, but I would really invite people to look at that website, Episcopal Common Prayer, because it has what's already authorized, as well as documents related to this task force in it. And then the other thing, one of the other major documents on it, which is longer and that I'm not going to read, Principles to Guide the Development of Liturgical Texts, lays out what Bishop Nel was just saying in more detail. And I'll just add that to me, one of the more sort of exciting, life-giving conversations that we had along the way was around thinking about texts that might deepen our engagement with the liturgical year, as Bishop Nel was just saying, around the incarnational cycle, imagining, sometimes there are other parts of the Anglican communion that have a post-communion prayer that's keyed to the liturgical year. There might be different collects that are more keyed to the liturgical year in that they are different for each of the, we're in a 3-year cycle, and sometimes the collect really doesn't match the biblical text assigned for the day. There's that sense that there was a real sense of energy that I noticed that came in that part of our conversation, in addition to other great moments. But as someone who loves the liturgical year, it really sort of activated that sense of building on what we already is so important to us.
Mhm.
Well, can I add another just a word in there? When the last General Convention, there were a number of prayer book resolutions that worked their way through the legislative process and onto the floor and were modified and changed in a variety of ways, and that finally at the end of the day gave us AO68. But a lot of folks on the call will probably remember that one of the other major resolutions that had a fair amount of traction were those among us, and there are many, and I'd even confess that there are many days I am one of them, who would argue that in so many ways, as I go around the church and visit congregations and parishes and whatever, so many places that haven't even begun to exploit the full richness and flexibility and liturgical and ritual possibility of the 1979 prayer book. And so there were some who were, arguing alternatively, how can we, rather than creating a new prayer book or whatever, maybe what we really ought to do is figure out a way to help people move ever more deeply into the one we've got and use it more fully. And I think it's important to note that even with the language of revision and amplification and enrichment and those kinds of things that are around this whole conversation, part of the task force's conversation and part of, I think, what we are hoping to encourage the church to do is to work this process in a way that helps everyone do precisely that, live ever more deeply and more profoundly into the frameworks and riches of the 1979 prayer book. And while that may take the form of adding a prayer or perhaps changing a structure slightly or adding an acclamation or a collect or additional services or additional prayers that we don't have, it would still be done in kind of a reference to the book that ultimately leads us more deeply into it and into its ecclesiology and into its theology and into the role it plays in our life. We're not trying to move away from the prayer book as we are trying to enrich and deepen it in ways that expand our ritual possibilities.
I want to turn to the principles of revision, and I'm noting that we're getting a lot of questions about theology, and some of them are quite specific, and some are more general. Anna Rossi asks, by theology consonant with the 1979 Book of Common Prayer for the Eucharistic prayers, how do we address the soteriology, substitutionary atonement, and the notion of might and power over other attributes of the divine that pervade them? Not calling for a break, but consonance feels too close for real response to theological evolutions of the last 40 years. So that's a very specific theological question. And I'm sort of wondering how do the principles of revision key to the theological assumptions that we're making in liturgical revision?
Cameron, you want to take a, I mean, whatever.
Well, I mean, I hear that question loud and clear. And, you know, in a scenario where the 79 Book of Common Prayer remains in the manner we've been describing, and also part of what happens with this framework piece, that it has this, that the BCP has this shaping effect, and liturgical additional, I don't want to say other, because part of what we talked about quite a bit as a task force was trying to create a scenario in which Eucharistic prayers and other already authorized sources, as well as material that's yet to come into being, not be marginalized. So I think what you end up with is a scenario in which Eucharistic prayers, there's a number of different, the theology is not utterly consistent across them. There's a spaciousness, and you know, some of the Eucharistic theology in one prayer won't align entirely, will be different in significant ways from other Eucharistic prayers. That's already true. I think according to what has just been described, that continues to be true. But I take your question very seriously, and I think it's one that those who carry the ball forward on this should also continue to take extremely seriously. What would you say, Bishop Nel?
Well, I mean, I quite agree. And when I use the word consonant, I guess what I'm really trying to say is that any new this doesn't stand in the way of any new theological developments or theological interpretations. You know, as long as they can comfortably stand alongside of our church's, you know, historic, creedal, Trinitarian, ecclesiological, I mean, the sort of basic frameworks of who we are as outlined in the prayer book. And there's, as Dr. Partridge says, there's a great deal of spaciousness in that already. Matter of fact, one of the things that has created a fair amount of criticism for the 1979 prayer book is in some people's minds, it's a bit too spacious. And I happen to fairly strongly disagree with that assessment, but nonetheless, I can see why some would do that. You know, one of the things, and you know, I'm sure Cameron will correct me if he thinks I'm overstating this, but one of the things that and we haven't always used this language, but in a lot of our task force conversations, we've approached a lot of these questions, you know, from the standpoint of we're not working here on subtraction. We're working here on appropriate addition that will widen the field, that will enrich the territory, that will, you know, allow a variety of things to emerge, but without, you know, any sense of suppressing or trying to bury that which has made us who we are, however imperfectly that may be.
So an expansive approach to revision would be one of the principles that we're embracing in this process, right? I've got a question from Liza Anderson, which is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it's Liza's question, so you know it's going to be interesting. Two, it actually is asking for something very specific. Liza says, as we encourage congregations to undertake appropriate liturgical experimentation on a local level, are there particular theological or liturgical constraints that you would identify with which those experiments should be appropriately bounded? Is absolutely everything up for grabs, or is it more that there is a kind of bounded space within which grassroots experimentation can occur? Sort of like, what is the larger container theologically within which we're imagining liturgical and prayer book revision?
Well, I mean, I think if you have not had a chance to go to the website and look at the draft, and let me underscore about 9 times it is a draft. The task force has to meet yet again at least one more time, if not more often, between now and when we send the materials forward for the convention. But if you haven't been to the website and looked at the principles document, and part of this is the resolution itself from General Convention basically establishes that framework, and you know, and basically I can actually quote from the resolution that first of all, what we do going forward will continue in faithful adherence to the historic rites of the Church Universals. They've been received and interpreted within the Anglican tradition of the 1979 prayer book, mindful of our existing ecumenical commitments. And I might also say not just ecumenical, but Anglican communion commitments. We've been attentive to what's going on in other families of the Anglican communion, while also providing space for encouraging the submission of and facilitating the perfection of rights that arise from the continual movement of the Holy Spirit among us and growing insights in our church, and be it further resolved that such revision utilize the riches of Holy Scripture, our church's liturgical, cultural, racial, generational, linguistic, gender, physical ability, class, and ethnic diversity in order to share common worship. And it goes on and talks about care of creation and diversity and so forth. But the resolution makes it very clear in more than one place that you know, expanding our horizons cannot happen in such a way that we can't recognize each other. That there must be a clear tie and connection to our both Christian biblical heritage as well as our Anglican heritage, and certain pieces there. I mean, this has got to, you know, it's sort of, you know, freshness and new insights, but certainly connected with the continuity of who we are, who we have been, and who we continue to claim to be.
Cameron, did you have a response?
I guess I'm kind of curious if there's a specific sort of scenario or set of scenarios that Liza is worried about that might help me. It's hard to give a really specific like delineation, though I understand the desire for that. You know, you know, what I guess I would say, you know, we should be doctrinally consistent. You know, we talk about the doctrine, discipline, and worship, and so we should, you know, whatever is being approved. I mean, but this is the role of the bishop, you know, in these places where there's supposed to be liturgical commissions everywhere, but you know, as they come up, that would be something to be especially mindful of. I don't have like a specific, you know, this is where the fence is, but I'd be curious to hear if there are particular things that are worrying to Liza.
Yeah, Cameron, I can think of just another perhaps helpful way of thinking about that. Years ago, I used to teach a class with Dick Norris of blessed memory, a great theologian of our church, to whom many of us are theologically indebted in many in various ways. But I remember one of the things that that Dr. Norris used to talk about with our class was that you know, he was very much a stickler on the church living in relationship to the Catholic creeds, to the Apostles' and Nicene creeds in particular. And yet he said, you know, those documents, he liked to think of them as the syllabus of the church's interests. And that if you look through the centuries, you know, we have at times, you know, we haven't changed the creeds, but we have certainly changed our interpretation of certain words and phrases and thoughts and so forth as time has gone on. But these are the topics of our continuing concern. But the church is never not continuing to explore those concerns and elucidate those concerns and rethink those concerns for the proclamation of the gospel in our own time. So and his point was that those give us a great stability and frame our interests, but they don't shut down the conversation. They very much keep the conversation open, in fact, precisely because of the stability.
And I wonder if
I just found it a helpful way of thinking about it.
If I can just say, I will confess I'm not, I have a hard time watching the chat and staying sort of locked in here, but I saw that Liza responded, so I have opened the chat and I am reading what she's written about some problematic things, and that I particularly am appreciating this, you know, that it's not about sort of seeming reactionary, but like you know, because of opposing all change, but because we've seen things that are really pretty clearly out of bounds, and it would be easier to embrace experimentation if there were some limits on it. So what I'm hearing from this is an invitation to the task force and whoever will, as I say, sort of carry the ball after, you know, as we're engaging this process, to bring that kind of feedback into that, that having a sense of there being things that are out of bounds, you know, that is, I mean, that is true, there are, but like saying, you know, being mindful that that this is a dynamic that we have to you know, have some sense of clarifying what's possible from our standpoint. So I just appreciate the question and the feedback.
there's a question from Amy Pringle, which may be a way of talking more about the sort of theological parameters that we're thinking of. She writes, there are riches in the Book of Common Prayer, but the 79 book is young. How can we further develop its emphasis on baptism and Eucharist? Which strikes me as an invitation to do what the task force says in its principles, which is adding, not subtracting, and a more, perhaps taking a new look through new optics at baptism and Eucharist. One of those, for example, Martha Kirkpatrick writes, one of my concerns with the Book of Common Prayer is what I feel is theological inadequacy around creation and our relationship with creation. Is the SCLM in conversation around this, especially in light of climate crisis? So again, it's how do we make theological statements in the liturgical categories of baptism and Eucharist, which are cornerstones to the 79 book, that are resonant with what's occurring today in the world, and developing a theology that addresses the current needs of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we have been very conscious on the task force, and again, we are not, our task at this stage is not to create new text and put new stuff out there. Our task, as we've understood it, is to kind of set up the frameworks and set up the direction so that the General Convention can create the space then in 2021 to make actual things happen. But that said, one of the things we've been most conscious of through this whole thing is the fact that, take creation care as an example, that even comes up in the enabling resolution of the task force, that we are to take that seriously in kind of providing the frameworks for moving forward, which I believe we have, and I believe that will be clear enough in time. And then, of course, you know, Paul will remember, as I suspect most of us on the call will remember, you know, the last ever how many general conventions is almost back as far as I can remember. There have been resolutions of General Convention that in various ways have asked to amend the prayer book around creation care matters. You know, and so, I mean, that's clear that in providing additional resources going forward and alternatives perhaps to some of the texts that we have now, that something like creation care will we've already said will have to play a somewhat larger role than they have in the past. But that's, you know, goes back to one of my very first points is, you know, part of this process is identifying those places where our ritual life, our common prayer life, it is not sufficiently rich either for a particular missional need, which creation care would fall under, or a particular pastoral need, which creation care may also fall under. I mean, there are, more, and so, but for me, that's part of what makes this exciting, and exciting work. And that is, what are those missional and pastoral things that our parishes, our liturgical leaders, our pastoral leaders, our lay and ordained, I mean, what do we need to ritualize? What do we need to pray about? What do we need to hold in our common, in the sort of receptacles of our common prayer, that are frankly at this point missing? And then how do we, in appropriate ways that are, in alignment with who we are biblically and theologically and Anglican wise, how do we fill those gaps in those ways?
And it does raise theological questions which might not have been asked. I mean, I'm thinking of occasional services, the revision we were working on in the last triennium, and the creation parts, including the St. Francis Day blessing of animals. And the question that occurred in the course of the conversation was, well, where are animals in the resurrection? How do we think about my dog who's like my child in the resurrection, which is not, that's not a new theological question. It's just one that hasn't been deeply asked by the Episcopal Church. So I'm curious about sort of more emerging theological questions as they relate to our liturgy, some of which are liturgical theological questions, and some of which are just theological questions, to make a very fine distinction. Cameron, I'm afraid I interrupted you. You were about to say something.
Well, I would appreciating your comments, and was just going to add to what Bishop Nel was saying, that on the question of creation and creation care and how that might be part of liturgical revision going forward. One of the things that we did name specifically as an area to explore is in the document Principles to Guide the Development of Liturgical Texts, was creation season, which many parishes, congregations already observe, and that is being, we're being invited to observe, but to think about it in the liturgical year at greater depth. And also, and this isn't related to, well, it isn't related to the season of creation piece, but some places are observing a longer Advent. I saw the Advent project pop up, flashed by the chat earlier, and that's something that my parish has been doing, inviting some conversation about the season of Advent and what the Advent project has already been exploring and sharing in the way of resources for years. But to just invite further exploration of the enriching of our liturgical year in that kind of way. But the creation season piece was what had come to mind as I was listening to the conversation. And I think you raised some really interesting questions that I don't have the answers to, Paul, so I'm not going to try to. But I think the fact that we're asking these questions, not only sort of about liturgy, but just theological questions, is incredibly significant.
And Paul, that also raises the question, that's very helpful, Cameron, it seems to me. It also raises the question in my mind, which is one of the things, if you go back through the life of the church and liturgical revision, whether it's in our church or other churches or whatever, one of the things that the church will struggle with going forward around some of these things is that what things are appropriate for the community of the baptized to make the centerpiece of their public prayer. And how is that list inclusive of, or in some cases different from, a list of things that the people of God need to be thoughtful about and prayerful about and engaged in, whether that's personally, politically, or otherwise. While there may be a lot of crossover in those two lists, they're not exactly in every case the same list. And that will be, of course, part of the conversation, part of the struggle going forward is, should the people of God care about this? Yes. Should it be a major feature in our public prayer? Maybe, maybe not. It really kind of depends, and we've made those decisions back and forth thousands of times in the history of the church. And I see no reason to think that having to make some of those hard decisions will not be a part of the future, which is not to say to eliminate anything prematurely or whatever, it's simply to say that the shape of our ritual concern and the shape of our total pastoral and missional concern may be parallel, but they won't match at every point.
Are there other principles? I want to make sure that we have enough opportunity to talk about the principles revision from the task force that stand out to you two as particularly important. Because I have questions from people that I can turn to, but I want to make sure that we articulate the principles that are sort of first principles.
I can just mention a couple, and I suspect that Cameron will want to enrich what I've got to say significantly. But a couple of things, and this is more form than matter, I suppose. But one of the things that the principles document talks about is sort of the certain characteristics of what liturgical texts need to do. And one is that ritual texts are prayed out loud. There's certain ways we have to learn to do that. And I know one of the things going back a number of years when we first were working on some of the supplemental liturgical texts that eventually became enriching our worship, some of the earlier drafts of those documents, the ideas were fine, and most of the ideas have been carried forward, but those earliest versions were not particularly oral in the sense of something that got said out loud and taken in and so forth, and how important that is. And that also the liturgy is dialogical. This is not something that the priest stands up and reads, but there's give and take between the liturgical leaders and congregations and readers and psalmists and singers and all kinds of things. It's a dialogical and rather dramatic process, and that it ultimately is given toward the building up of the body of Christ. There may be matters of our pastoral and missional concern, but are not directly related in a public ritual to the building up of the body and to the enrichment of the baptized for their own ministry in the life of the world. Lots of things to consider, many of which are intangible.
Cameron, do you want to add?
I completely concur. There's so many different things I could highlight. One that I don't think I've explicitly highlighted is that we have is around expansive and inclusive language, which was one of the things we were particularly asked to pay attention to in our authorizing resolution. And we created a document called Expansive and Inclusive Language Guidelines. And we've already kind of covered some of it, but just that we seek to maximize rather than to erase language from our liturgical lexicon. So with expansive language for God, inclusive language for human beings, although I think there should be an expansive dimension to inclusive language as well, but is meant to address the reality that language for human beings can be biased, frankly. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir on that, but really mindful of that. We talked about language as a gift of God. We underscored what Bishop Nel just said, but with a particular emphasis on being mindful of expansive and inclusive language, attending to cultures, multiple cultures, to making sure to be careful about translation, dynamic translation, which was another thing we were specifically asked to pay attention to. And that to also be mindful that a single prayer doesn't necessarily bear the weight of, there's multiple, it's that expansive sense of there's multiple prayers, and there may be, in that additive sense, one particular prayer may not do everything and work in all ways, but other prayers can help catch that up. I'm being off the cuff here, but I would invite folks to look at what we had to say about expansive and inclusive language in the document. And I think in our conversation about that, we also acknowledge that there can be tensions. And this, looking back to earlier in the conversation, there can be theological tensions within what's contained in our tradition, but we acknowledge the tension and allow it to be generative was a phrase that came up in this.
Uh-oh.
I think Cameron froze.
There, he's back now.
You froze for a second.
I did. Well, maybe that was providential. Maybe I said something terrible.
The Holy Spirit taking care of it, right?
A question which is adjacent to what we were just talking about in terms of language is the question of dismantling racism. And Jacob Pierce asks, what conversations are there on the SCLM and Taskforce regarding more liturgies to form us in the work of dismantling racism? He adds, this seems particularly pertinent in an American context, especially as we consider how the liturgy forms us for participation in God's mission in the world. The 1979 book seems inadequate in this regard, except for a vague nod to justice and dignity in the baptismal covenant and a collect or two.
Really important question. We definitely talked about racism within the task force, and it's how our liturgy should at the very least seek not to participate in it. We had conversations about imagery of light and dark and how that gets associated in the tradition in ways that we don't want to participate in with good and evil. And so the same document that I was referencing when Zoom froze me or whatever has some reference to that, but that's not addressing how liturgy can specifically form us for the work of racial justice in the way the questioner was asking. And I think that's an incredibly important question that we should be asking in the task force, and that going forward as this process continues. I will say in our diocese, Paul, I mean, we just had a liturgical engagement, engaging with the history of the doctrine of discovery and of indigenous peoples here in the Diocese of California. And we went through a process of learning and dialogue and refraining from a liturgy of lament before we could have a sense of what we were lamenting for. But the work of lament as absolutely crucial to the kind of work we're talking about that I feel like the question has raised is an example of some liturgical work that can support what I hear being asked for. So that's just one small piece of an answer, but to that really important question. I don't know what Bishop Nel might like to say.
Well, I'm quite in agreement with everything, and we have talked about this at some length, and we'll continue to talk about it and pass along our encouragement to those who come after us. I think it's in creating liturgical texts. I would have a little hesitance to say, well, how do I create a liturgy how do I create a liturgy that takes greater into account some specific topic, whether it's or need or reality in our world, whether that's racism or some other topic. as opposed to how does the liturgy help me as a disciple of Jesus, as a member of the baptized, be convicted about my life and role in the world, that is in constantly, hopefully, as a disciple of Jesus, battling something as evil and as nasty and as unnecessary as racism. I mean, is the point of the liturgy to transform me as a baptized disciple into constantly challenging the racism, the ugliness, the whatever, not only in myself, but in the world in which I live? Or is the liturgy more directly aimed at racism itself? Well, I mean, and there's a sweet spot between those two extremes, probably, that in any number of places one has to discover. I wouldn't ever argue that it's one or the other. But in the public liturgy of the baptized, it's how do we name those things that I am personally and spiritually and sacramentally and in other ways transformed to be that new creation in the world.
And it's certainly, my own research has shown that the baptismal covenant and the language around justice and dignity was very specifically targeted towards racism in the period in which it was crafted, and that there was, a lot of critique of that addition because it seemed too on spot in the historical moment. And I think it's interesting that, that the questioner thinks that's a little vague, and it is a little vague. And it certainly could be that we could articulate more clearly what injustice and the lack of dignity is when we come to the interrogations in baptism. And I get Neil, your point is really well taken, and it's really, what is the instrumental quality of liturgy versus the formational quality of liturgy? Are we striving to say everything the right way, or are we striving to make disciples in the liturgy? And maybe we're trying to do both, which would certainly, fit in with the principles of including more and more and more.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think also, in our, there are lots of words and phrases, not only in the baptismal covenant, but in other places in the prayer book, that I can remember back in the mid 1970s, were really kind of edgy. Mm-hmm. That now 40 plus years later, 2 generations later, as the church has changed, as the world has changed, as reality has changed in so many ways, no longer have their edginess. And part of this work may be to restore some edginess for a new generation. Mm-hmm. But I would anticipate doing that in some sort of continuity with the edginess that went before us.
So there's a question that has come back from yesterday, which I'm going to let you two address. Will we be discussing liturgical theology in this webinar? For instance, the fact that so few clergy are 100% behind substitutionary atonement, yet the BCP and hymnal have nothing but. We preach one understanding of the cross at the ambo, then step over to the altar and pray another.
To God be the glory.
I for a moment I thought you had both frozen, but
no. I would have to say that I guess I stand on the side of the fence for the sort of full enrichment of all these ideas. The fact that we still write books on modes of the atonement, and I don't know, I've lost count. I mean, Lord have mercy. And there are ones that go back to the first millennium and to the patristic era, and there are ones that have had variations through the life of the church. some were enormously valuable and necessary for the day in which they were born, lost that kind of vitality, except in the history of theology, perhaps. And you know, I have my own anxieties about various modes of the atonement that we've inherited, and and I also have some heartburn about some of the, shall we say, substitutions for for that. But rather than laboring over that, I prefer to wallow in the richness of all that, and in the discovery of all that, and what's in, you know, what's, you know, and so again, I operate from a position of well, you know, one of my great colleagues in the liturgical world, and that many of you have probably read most of, not all of his books, is Gordon Lathrop, the Lutheran liturgist, who constantly is talking about juxtaposition. That's his, you know, that there would be one word on his gravestone, you know, juxtaposition. And you know, and you know, Gordon talks constantly about the fact, well, you know, you have this thought and this reality, or this truth and this thought and this reality and this truth, and you put them next to each other, and there's an energy and there's an explosion and there's a depth and there's a whatever, you know, you know, I mean, it's sort of like I flippantly said to a friend not long ago, you know, I do not believe I live in a 3-tiered universe. But at the same time, I look forward to going to heaven. You know, completely contradictory ideas, metaphorical and all kinds of other stuff going on and all that, you know, but I prefer to wallow in the richness of all that rather than to sort of decide I've got to fix something. Now, Cameron, you go ahead. Fix all that I just said.
There are absolutely, you know, theologies, and especially the hymns, I find that I find myself singing and that I don't fully agree with.
Yeah, me too.
It happens. But I guess with enriching our worship, I don't see substitutionary atonement at work in those Eucharistic prayers. So I think there are, for those for whom I'm not seeing the particular issue with that, but I understand obviously where BCP does have that, but I guess I don't see it as quite as either or as what the question seems to describe in terms of an absolute constant state of being in disagreement theologically when you're liturgically leading. I don't experience it in that way. All that said, you know, the additive approach that's at work in the documents that we've produced as a task force does invite or continue to acknowledge that juxtaposition that Bishop Nel was just talking about.
And it speaks to the truth that we are not a theological monoculture.
No.
In the church, that we do have a breadth of theological riches, not all of which are necessarily agreed upon.
Yeah.
Or consonant with each other.
Or consonant with each other, right? There are a couple of questions I'd like to turn to, and these are more about sort of formation. How do people come to learn about the 79 prayer book without classic texts like Hatchett's commentary of the American prayer book, which are no longer in print? And sort of how do we, because many participants are representatives of the diocese who are sort of tasked with going back to the diocese and saying, here's what I learned at the webinar. How do we share what we're learning in this process of revision with the larger church? And how do we do that really in anticipation of the next General Convention, for the sake of the General Convention?
Well, one thing, and Cameron's already said something about this, but you know, I would encourage people on the call, if you've not already, to spend some time on the website that the task force has put together. The website is a piece that we're hoping that that our successors, after the task force finishes its work, turns it over, but this work will continue in some form or another, and that they will continue to enrich that website. But what's there on the website is not only some of these documents that Cameron and I have basically been riffing off of in the last hour, but also there's as complete as anywhere I know, a complete library of every liturgical text in every language that the Episcopal Church has meaningfully authorized. And when you put it all together on the same page, you discover that there's a whole lot more out there, than one might immediately be aware of. And I can remember when our team on the task force put all that together, and I first went to it. I mean, there were a number of texts that I'd simply forgotten. I mean, I in a couple of cases participated in their creation, but just forgot about that they're out there and usable and so forth. So I would encourage people to do that. And one of the gifts of some of these documents that we've created, I believe, for people to study and think about back home is, take, for example, the principles document that weaves together a whole variety of things, some of which both either the General Convention or the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music or other bodies have woven together. I mentioned earlier, for example, that we have kept one eye on the Anglican Communion. Now, we're all independent provinces. We do our thing differently, and there's some unique differences, of course, between the American Anglican tradition and that of other parts. But for example, if you go to the Anglican Communion website, you had to dig a little bit because they've redone the website. It used to be easier to find this stuff, but it's there. I went this morning to make sure I could say this. But there's a lot of stuff on the Anglican Communion website that brings together the conversations of the International Anglican Liturgical Consultation, in which a number of us in the Episcopal Church have been active members of over several decades. And while we're not necessarily proposing any kind of lockstep thing with that, keeping an eye on that material and how it represents the larger theological and liturgical and sacramental thinking of the communion is at least a piece that ought to be in the mix, as well as ecumenical pieces, baptism, Eucharist, and ministry, a whole variety of things there. So, if you sort of go to the website and let it lead you places, as well as go to the Anglican Communion Liturgy section on the Anglican Communion website and let it lead you places, there's a rich treasure trove of things that would give people really thoughtful and up-to-date ways of talking about some of these issues.
And I also think that diocesan liturgical commissions can have a particular role in connecting to the work that the task force is doing and sharing them in dioceses, just to add to what Bishop Nel has said. And I'm aware too that I think there's a volume coming out from Church Publishing soon related to prayer book revision that will hopefully further the reformation process as well.
And there's one, there's several of those. I mean, there was a whole rush of 3 or 4 books just before the turn of the century, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, on potential prayer book revision. And then the book, I got it right here somewhere. It's just out of reach, on prayer book revision that will be coming out from Church Publishing, that Dr. Partridge has an article in, I have helpfully read. And then Robert Pritchard of Virginia Seminary has a book, Issues in Prayer Book Revision, I believe it's called. And several people that I know are on the call have contributed to that. And so there are a lot of things out there to read and work on.
There's a question about what's the game plan for an expansive language version of Eucharistic Prayer C? The list of patriarchs plus matriarchs, does it include not just the wives, but also the rest? And I actually can speak to that because that was a piece of work given to the SCLM from the General Convention, which is coming soon to a General Convention near you, whenever that occurs. We actually are going to present 2 different versions of Prayer C. one of which retains the dialogical structure of the prayer, and one of which is with a set response throughout the prayer. And we've worked hard on it. We feel good about the text. We're going to get another chance to talk about it at our next SCLM meeting, and then we'll have it in the Blue Book, so it'll be available for your perusal whenever that is. And this is another sort of practical question. This is from Ellen Johnston. How can bishops be encouraged to establish a liturgical commission?
Well, I will, if here again, if you go to the Taskforce website, you will discover a list of the dioceses of the Episcopal Church and a parallel list of dioceses whose liturgical commissions are intact and that have been in dialogue with the task force, either by sending us materials or asking us questions or a variety of ways of engagement, some of which has been enormously helpful to the task force. But you will see pretty quickly, and I'm just guessing here, I haven't done an actual count, but we're looking at something probably no more than 25% of the dioceses have active liturgical commissions, or if they do, they've not been in touch with us. As we have pleaded, and we've sent out letters to bishops, to the liturgical contacts in every diocese that we're aware of. We have put it in ENS. We've done we've sort of done everything we know to do to say, please enact these things and get busy and support and help this effort. I would hope, and by the way, Ellen, the other thing that's happened is not only myself, but others on the task force, the bishops on the task force have taken floor time at meetings of the House of Bishops to plead to if you don't have a liturgical commission, establish one. If nothing else, not even if they're not going to do anything locally, so there's a group of people in your diocese that we can communicate with and get a channel of communication going. We have pleaded that this is to happen, and I would be candid to say our efforts have not been particularly successful, but we will continue to do that. We'll continue to ask the bishops, we'll continue to support the bishops. We've tried in many cases to get to other people in the diocese that we know are liturgical leaders in dioceses and help them sort of, pardon the French, goose the bishop a little bit around these things. And in some cases that's helped and worked, but it's been the hardest part of this work to get a diocesan level buy-in.
Here's a very pertinent question from Amy Crawford. What are you most wanting to receive from liturgical commissions right now? Are you still open to receiving commission comments on the draft documents, which initially had a please send date of April 15th? And are you also still receiving liturgical texts?
The answer to both those questions is yes, and you'll find the way to do that on the website. Both send your feedback and your comments as well as documents. I think we're probably past the point in this triennium where any document submitted at this point will get a lot of attention, frankly. But one of the things we're doing is in addition to this material that we're putting forth to the convention, which are really guidelines, principles, a structure for how do we move this work forward. We've also received a lot of material that we will pass on to our successors. I mean, and I put it that way because, this task force was created for this triennium, and it will be up to the convention about how this work goes forward, whether this goes back to the SCLM, which some of us believe that's the appropriate way to do this. Others, maybe it's another task. We don't know what the convention will do about enabling this work going forward, but we do believe it will enable a way forward. And so we are preparing ourselves as a task force to pass along absolutely everything that we have received, hopefully curated in a helpful manner and organized in a helpful manner. But those who come after us, even if those who come after us are still some of us, who knows, will nonetheless be ready to do that. So. Yes, so if you have comments, questions, anything, go ahead and file them and send them through the resources of the website, and we will at the very least make sure they end up in the lap of the right committee or subcommittee or whatever, even if between now and the end of the triennium, which is coming quickly, it doesn't see much energy. It will get passed on, that I can assure you.
In the last 5 minutes of our time together, I wonder if there is a question that has not been asked that you would like to have asked.
You know, I guess the question that I'm interested, would love to, you know, hear a response to. You know, I think that the enabling resolution here has probably found a very good place, walking a really sort of good line in the life of the church. You know, it's a resolution that's does its best to honor who we are and who we have been, and in the fullness of that, which is not all positive, but nonetheless, mission and ministry gets done and lives change, and yet it has opened our horizons, but it has not opened our horizons just, you know, in a willy-nilly way with no boundaries or anything. It has actually established some boundaries about, okay, we're going to push the envelope here, but there's still some frameworks that are meaningful to us. You know, scripture, tradition, our history, our theological orientation as Episcopalians. You know, and so, you know, it was painful to be a part of the process to create that resolution and to get all the pieces in place. But I think when the sausage finally got made, that we found a kind of, no pun intended, a middle way, you know, but between, you know, where we are and where we need to be. And to do that in a typically Episcopalian orderly fashion. So I hope there's at least some sense that that's taking the broadest possible framework. The convention gave us a very fine gift that will move this forward in a healthy and wholesome and I think really quite positive way.
Cameron?
I was thinking as you were speaking about what the enabling resolution did, that it's comprehensive. It seeks to be comprehensive, perhaps maddeningly so at points, but it does. And it creates a space that we've been trying to carry on the work we were invited to do, and that those after us will do in whatever way unfolds. I didn't have a specific question that I was hoping I'd be asked. Paul, was there one that you particularly would like to ask that hasn't been?
When are we getting a new prayer book?
In the fullness of time.
In the fullness of time. Let me just express thanks, Cameron and Neil, to both of you for your conversation today, for engaging the questions as many as we could get to. And I do encourage our participants to come back at 4 o'clock Eastern time for our next plenary, which will feature Juan Oliver and Jamon Taylor, who will be talking about the Book of Common Prayer, specifically talking around issues of translation, language, and race and culture. There are many more conversations to be had, and as I said at the beginning of our session, you'll be getting notification when the recordings and transcripts are available. Sarah, what do you have for us?
A quick reminder that the evaluations and recordings from yesterday did go out this morning. So you should have received that in your inbox this morning Eastern time. I also just sent out the evaluation for our conversation that just concluded. And a quick note to the diocesan reps. If you are registered as a diocesan rep, you received an email yesterday afternoon that does include information about the timing for the conversations tomorrow. Another one will be sent out this afternoon, and then an additional one tomorrow just before the conversations begin.
Cameron and Neil, again, thank you so much for sharing your time and your gifts and your intellect and your grace with us. We appreciate it. And
Thanks, everybody.
good. See you all later today.